John Wayne Gacy, 1970s. This killer clown murdered at least 33 young boys and men, burying most of their bodies on his property and becoming one of America's most infamous serial offenders. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942, the son of a hardworking but abusive father and a protective mother who tried to shield her children from the harsh temper that dominated the household. From an early age, Gacy seemed to live with contradictions. He was the boy who wanted desperately to please his father yet could never quite earn his approval, the teenager who dreamed of belonging yet often found himself on the margins, sickly and insecure. That hunger for acceptance followed him into adulthood, where he built a public image of generosity, community involvement, and cheerful entertainment as Pogo the Clown. To neighbors, business associates, and even local politicians, he was the man who threw block parties, hired young men for construction jobs, and dressed in costume to make children laugh at hospitals and charity events. No one suspected that behind the grease-paint smile and suburban respectability lay a man who would become one of America's most notorious serial killers. Gacy's crimes began in the 1970s, a decade when suburban Chicago seemed an unlikely backdrop for horror. The era was marked by optimism in many ways, new homes, growing businesses, and an expanding middle class. Gacy himself seemed to embody that promise. He had built a small but successful construction company, PDM Contractors, which specialized in remodeling and repair work. He was active in local Democratic politics, rubbing shoulders with city officials and proudly displaying photographs of himself with prominent figures. He played the role of model citizen convincingly, hosting large neighborhood gatherings complete with food, drink, and entertainment. It was during these times, dressed as his clown persona, that he cultivated the image of someone harmless and fun-loving. The duality was chilling. In public he was Pogo the Clown. In private he was a predator with urges he could not, or would not, control. The victims were often teenage boys and young men, some of them runaways, others simply seeking part-time work. Gacy exploited their need for money, offering employment through his company or luring them with the promise of quick cash. He would sometimes approach them at bus stations or on the street, using charm and authority to persuade them to come with him. Once inside his Norwood Park home, however, the atmosphere shifted. What began as friendly conversation might quickly turn sinister. Gacy often used a ruse he called the handcuff trick, in which he would show the boys how easily he could slip out of handcuffs, then persuade them to try it themselves. Once restrained, they became trapped in a nightmare they could not escape. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men, hiding his crimes in the most macabre fashion imaginable. Many of the bodies he buried in the crawl space beneath his house, others in the backyard, and a few he disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. The sheer scale of his secret graveyard was beyond comprehension. It was as though he had turned the very foundation of his home into a tomb. Yet for years, he managed to maintain the illusion of normalcy, carrying on business, clown performances, and political networking even as the corpses piled up beneath his floorboards. The mask began to slip in 1978, when a teenager named Robert Peast went missing after telling his mother he was going to talk to a man about a job. That man was John Wayne Gacy. Peast's disappearance triggered an investigation that gradually unraveled the carefully constructed facade Gacy had maintained. Detectives began to notice inconsistencies in his story, a nervous energy that betrayed the confidence he usually exuded. Surveillance teams followed him as he attempted to carry on life as usual, yet he grew increasingly erratic, drinking heavily and confiding to acquaintances that his life was falling apart. Finally, armed with a search warrant, police entered his house in December of 1978. What they found would shock the world. The stench of decay hit officers almost immediately. Digging beneath the crawl space revealed human remains, skeletal fragments intermingled with soil. As the excavation continued, the extent of Gacy's crimes became horrifyingly clear. Body after body was unearthed, the tally rising until it reached 33 known victims. The case dominated headlines, not only because of the staggering number of murders, but because of the disturbing contradiction between Gacy's public life and his private monstrosity. He was not the shadowy stranger lurking in alleys. He was the neighbor who waved from his porch, the man who dressed as a clown for children's parties, the ordinary American hiding unimaginable evil in plain sight. His arrest and subsequent trial revealed further details that chilled the nation. Prosecutors described the methods he used to trap his victims, the sadistic patterns of control, the casual way he disposed of lives. The courtroom became a stage where his double life was dissected piece by piece, exposing the psychological complexities of a man who claimed he could not remember some of the killings, as if compartmentalization could erase responsibility. The jury, however, saw through his defenses, convicting him of multiple murders and sentencing him to death. Gacy would spend years on death row, painting clowns and other images as he awaited his fate. In 1994, he was executed by lethal injection, closing a chapter on one of America's darkest criminal sagas. What makes the story of John Wayne Gacy resonate even decades later is not only the scale of his crimes, but the unsettling questions they raise about trust, appearances, and the hidden capacities for violence within ordinary-looking lives. He was a man who shook hands with politicians by day and murdered boys by night, who made children laugh in a clown suit even as he concealed bodies beneath his home. His story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil does not always announce itself with fangs and shadows. Sometimes it wears a painted smile and lives next door. The roots of John Wayne Gacy's monstrous double life can be traced back to his upbringing, though no single event can ever fully explain the cruelty that would emerge later. His childhood in Chicago was marked by frequent illness and hospitalizations, which isolated him from other children and fueled his desire for attention and approval. His father, an auto repair machinist, drank heavily and lashed out with verbal and physical abuse. Nothing Gacy did ever seemed enough to earn his father's respect. Even when he tried to participate in activities or show responsibility, he was belittled or accused of weakness. This constant tension created in him a deep resentment alongside an almost desperate need to be liked by others. By adolescence, he had already learned how to wear a mask of charm, pleasing teachers, peers, and authority figures while hiding insecurities within. As he grew into adulthood, Gacy's personal relationships reflected that same contradiction. He married, fathered children, and sought the stability of suburban family life, yet he could not maintain it. His first marriage collapsed under the strain of his erratic behavior and early brushes with the law, including a conviction in Iowa in the 1960s for sexual assault of a teenage boy. He served time in prison but was released after 18 months for good behavior, seemingly eager to rebuild. By the early 1970s, he had relocated back to Chicago, remarried, and launched his construction business. To neighbors, he appeared rehabilitated, an ambitious man who was climbing the ladder of success. Beneath the surface, however, the cycle of predation was already beginning. The house he bought on West Somerdale Avenue became the stage for his hidden crimes. Outwardly, it was an ordinary split-level suburban home, with a tidy lawn and decorations that suggested domestic comfort. Inside, it was both a family residence and a workshop for PDM contractors, where young men frequently came and went under the guise of employment. For many of the victims, their disappearance was barely noticed at first. Some were estranged from families, others were runaways or troubled youths whose absences did not immediately spark alarm. Gacy counted on this anonymity, selecting victims who existed on the margins, who could be persuaded to trust him, or whose loss would not bring rapid police attention. The chilling ingenuity of his methods lay in their banality. He often offered a drink, a joint, or simply conversation, disarming his victims with friendliness. The handcuff trick became his signature ploy, presented as a harmless magic act that fit neatly with his clown persona. Once the cuffs snapped shut on the wrists of a young man, the illusion of safety shattered. From that moment, he wielded complete power. His basement and crawl space became both prison and grave, a place where laughter and music from neighborhood gatherings above contrasted grotesquely with the silent suffering below. For years, the pattern repeated. A boy would go missing, a family would file a report, but without clear leads, the trail went cold. Some parents begged police to consider Gacy as a suspect, but his outward persona shielded him. How could a man so involved in civic life, who entertained sick children in hospitals, possibly be capable of such atrocities? His ability to manipulate impressions was one of his most lethal tools. He attended political rallies, posed for photographs with mayors and first ladies, hosted barbecues for hundreds of guests, all while bodies decomposed under his floorboards. By the mid-1970s, the number of missing youths connected, however loosely, to Gacy began to grow. Still, law enforcement had no conclusive evidence. He operated with unnerving confidence, believing himself untouchable. His arrogance manifested in small ways, boasting of his contacts, intimidating employees, and occasionally letting slip comments that hinted at darker deeds. Some who worked for him recalled crude jokes or unsettling remarks, but dismissed them as the off-color humor of a brash boss. Few could have imagined that the man joking about having a cemetery in his house meant it quite literally. It was Robert Piest's disappearance in December 1978 that finally brought the facade crashing down. Unlike some earlier victims, Piest was not a drifter but a 17-year-old with strong family ties. He had told his mother he was going to see a man about a construction job, providing a crucial lead. Investigators quickly connected that description to Gacy, who had been in the pharmacy where Piest worked on the night he vanished. From the start, Gacy attempted to deflect suspicion, claiming he knew nothing and offering shifting alibis. But detectives were not convinced. They placed him under surveillance, watching as his behavior became increasingly erratic. During the surveillance, Gacy drank heavily, drove aimlessly, and even confessed to acquaintances that his life was over. He appeared to unravel under the pressure, alternating between attempts at charm and moments of despair. Detectives noted how he seemed unable to maintain composure, and suspicions deepened. A search warrant granted them entry to his house, where the first signs of decay confirmed what they feared. Once the crawl space was opened and digging began, the nightmare fully emerged. Skeletal remains, clothing fragments, and the unmistakable evidence of multiple burials stunned even seasoned investigators. The excavation of the property became a grim spectacle, reported daily in newspapers and on television. Each day seemed to bring news of another body uncovered, another family given devastating confirmation. Forensic teams worked methodically, numbering and cataloging the remains, while the nation looked on in disbelief. The scale of the crimes, 33 victims confirmed, most of them buried on the property, placed Gacy among the most prolific killers in American history. The fact that he had operated in plain sight for years, while simultaneously cultivating a reputation as a charitable community member, only deepened the horror. His trial in 1980 drew immense attention. Prosecutors laid out the pattern of abduction, assault, and murder with relentless detail, presenting the jury with evidence not only of the physical crimes, but of the cold calculation behind them. Gacy's defense attempted to argue insanity, claiming he suffered from multiple personality disorder and could not fully account for his actions. But the jury was unconvinced. They saw a man who had meticulously lured, trapped, and disposed of victims, all while continuing his daily routines without outward remorse. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was clear: guilty on 33 counts of murder. The sentence was death. For the next 14 years, Gacy remained on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During that time, he gave interviews, denied responsibility, shifted blame, and painted unsettlingly cheerful images of clowns and landscapes that were sold to collectors. Some saw his paintings as macabre souvenirs of infamy. Others viewed them as further evidence of his manipulative narcissism. He never expressed genuine remorse for the lives he took. On May 10, 1994, he was executed by lethal injection. His final words, reportedly flippant, underscored the lack of empathy that had defined his life. John Wayne Gacy's trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national reckoning with a kind of evil that had been hiding in plain sight. As journalists filled the courtroom and families of victims sat waiting for answers, prosecutors pieced together a narrative that revealed not only the brutality of the crimes, but the disturbing ordinariness of the man who committed them. Gacy sat through much of it with the composure of someone accustomed to performing roles. Sometimes he seemed engaged, leaning toward his lawyers and whispering notes, and other times he appeared almost bored, as though the accounts of torture and murder were about someone else entirely. For the families who had lost sons and brothers, that detachment was one of the cruelest blows, a reminder that the man responsible for their grief seemed incapable of feeling the weight of it. The defense team mounted an insanity plea, arguing that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder, that within him existed Jack Hanley, a cruel alter ego who committed the crimes, and Pogo the Clown, the harmless entertainer who symbolized his desire to please others. Psychiatrists were called to the stand to examine whether he could distinguish right from wrong, whether he acted under compulsion or choice. But the evidence of planning, how he lured victims with job offers, restrained them with tricks, buried bodies with methodical care, undermined any claim of diminished responsibility. The jury saw a man who understood exactly what he was doing, who concealed his crimes not because he was confused but because he knew they were wrong. Each day of the trial peeled back another layer of his secret life. Witnesses described working for him at PDM contractors, recounting how he often had young men living at the house, how he boasted of political connections, how he sometimes displayed flashes of cruelty or unsettling humor. Families of the missing told of the last time they saw their sons, the unanswered phone calls, the long nights of worry. Forensic experts testified about the painstaking process of excavation, of matching dental records and personal effects to skeletal remains, of the harrowing task of giving names back to the dead. It was not only a trial of John Wayne Gacy, but of the system that had failed to catch him sooner, despite red flags stretching back over a decade. In March 1980, the jury deliberated for just hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 33 counts of murder. The sentence was death. For the victims' families, it was a measure of justice, though no punishment could undo the losses. For the public, it was both relief and horror. Relief that he would never walk free, horror that such a man had walked among them for so long. Gacy's years on death row revealed further contradictions. He became a subject of endless fascination, granting interviews to journalists, artists, and even amateur sleuths who hoped to pry into the mind of a killer. In those conversations, he often deflected blame, claiming he had no memory of some murders, suggesting accomplices who were never proven to exist, or insisting he had been framed. He seemed less concerned with truth than with control of the narrative, relishing the attention even as he sat in a cell. He turned to painting, producing dozens of works that ranged from self-portraits as Pogo the Clown to religious and landscape scenes. Some collectors sought them as morbid curiosities, while critics denounced the sales as profiting from horror. The paintings only deepened the paradox. A man who had destroyed so many lives now creating images of innocence and cheer. Meanwhile, the process of identifying victims continued long after the trial. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to revisit remains that had not been matched in the 1980s. Families who had lived for decades without answers were sometimes given the closure of a confirmed identity. Yet even today, some victims remain unnamed, their stories swallowed by the silence of that crawl space. They are reminders that Gacy's crimes were not just numbers or headlines but individual lives, each with a family, a future stolen. Psychologists and criminologists studied the case for insights into the mind of a serial killer. Gacy fit certain patterns: childhood abuse, difficulty with stable relationships, early criminal behavior, but he also defied easy categorization. His ability to maintain a thriving business, a marriage, and a public image of generosity set him apart from the stereotypical loner predator. He thrived in social settings, sought recognition from politicians, and craved admiration. Some experts labeled him a psychopath, pointing to his lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and superficial charm. Others emphasized the compartmentalization of his life, how he could entertain children as a clown in one moment and bury a body in his crawl space the next. The contradictions became a case study in the terrifying elasticity of human behavior. His execution on May 10, 1994, brought an end to his personal story but not to his cultural presence. Crowds gathered outside the prison in Illinois, some holding signs celebrating the death penalty, others protesting its use. When the lethal injection was administered, witnesses noted his lack of visible remorse, his final words dismissive and defiant. In death, as in life, he seemed unwilling to acknowledge the devastation he had caused. Yet the legacy of John Wayne Gacy extended far beyond the prison walls. His crimes reshaped public consciousness about safety, trust, and the hidden dangers in ordinary communities. Parents warned children more urgently about strangers. Communities looked more skeptically at those who seemed too good to be true. And law enforcement agencies developed more robust methods for tracking missing persons. His killer clown persona left an indelible mark on popular culture, inspiring films, novels, and urban legends. Though many of those fictional adaptations bore little resemblance to the real man, they drew on the unsettling truth he embodied, that evil can wear a smiling mask. For Chicago, the scars lingered. Survivors, relatives, and former neighbors struggled to reconcile memories of backyard barbecues and cheerful greetings with the revelation of mass graves beneath the floorboards. The house on West Somerdale Avenue was eventually demolished, the ground cleared in an effort to erase its associations, but memories could not be bulldozed away. For many, it remained a haunted space, a reminder of how easily appearances can deceive. The story of Gacy also sparked broader questions about how society treats marginalized youth. Many of his victims were runaways, gay teenagers, or young men estranged from families. Their vulnerabilities made them targets, and their disappearances were not always treated with urgency by authorities. Critics argued that if the victims had come from wealthier or more socially connected families, the investigation might have moved faster. In that sense, the Gacy case was not only about one man's evil, but about systemic failures that allowed him to operate unchecked. Even decades later, his name evokes a shiver. He is invoked in documentaries, criminology textbooks, and popular media as shorthand for hidden monstrosity. The clown makeup, once intended as a playful disguise, became a symbol of deception, of evil lurking behind innocence. He remains part of the grim pantheon of 20th-century serial killers whose cases forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Gacy's story is how ordinary it all appeared until the end. He lived in a suburban neighborhood, operated a small business, participated in politics, and entertained children, all roles that should have signaled normalcy. But behind the facade was a man who turned his own home into a graveyard, who thrived on domination, and who never fully accounted for the enormity of his crimes. That contradiction is what makes his story endure, not as morbid entertainment, but as a cautionary tale about trust, vigilance, and the hidden capacities of human cruelty. In the end, John Wayne Gacy was executed, his house destroyed, his victims memorialized, and his paintings scattered among collectors. Yet the unease he represents cannot be so easily erased. He reminds us that monsters do not always live in shadows or wear obvious disguises. Sometimes they live next door, hosting parties, shaking hands and making children laugh, even as they conceal horrors beneath the floor.